Hi, everyone. Welcome to the 50 States Highpointing Podcast. I'm your host, Lauren, and the Highpointer we're speaking with today is Phil from Massachusetts. Hey, Phil, welcome to the show.
Hey, thanks for having me.
Yeah. So this is going to be an exciting episode. I'm really looking forward to talking to you and hearing about your highpointing background, as it is pretty unique. But before we get started into all your different high points, can you tell the listeners how you got started in the outdoors, how you got started high pointing, and where that's taken you?
Yeah, so my first high point was Mount Mitchell. It was in the summer of 2017. It was after my first year in the classroom, and I went on a solo road trip across the country. I got out as far west as Texas, and then went all the way down towards New Orleans, and then up the East Coast. And there's this town called Asheville. I don't know if you've been down there, where I really
Love
like
it there.
I almost went to college there, and I was kind of drawn to it. And,
Yeah.
liberal arts college, middle of the mountains, and so I was staying at a little hostel, and made some friends, and we went to brew pub across the street, and one of the people working there was saying that they were going to go up. They were training for a bigger climb in Colorado, and they were going up this peak called Mount Mitchell, and I'd never hiked a mountain before. And although I did a little bit of backpacking in Yosemite, but that was a very different elevation
Cool.
deal out there. Yeah, it was super cool. But the person said it's the highest mountain east of the Mississippi River. And I thought, oh, that's pretty cool. I think I'll give that a shot. And they, recommended a trail. And I had no idea what I was doing. I brought a 70-liter pack with me for some reason. For like a
You look like you were hiking the AT.
It was it was the pack that I had bought for Yosemite a few weeks earlier, backpacking with friends.
Okay.
And I just had packed in the car, but it's pretty clear I had no idea what I was doing. And but I did wake up very early. I did not wear the correct apparel. I think I was wearing like a Bernie Sanders cutoff T-shirt or something. And just started off at the trailhead at 4:35 in the morning, and I did it by myself too. And I just remember feeling really just calm and happy the whole time, and just really enjoying being outdoors. It was hard, and I was definitely not in the fittest of shape at the time. But I got to the summit, and it sat next to the sign, and there's a great picture of me on my Instagram of me just kind of not passed out, but very, very tired. And went back down, and I went back to that brew pub and told all of my new friends there that I got to the highest point east of the Mississippi, and that's kind of all she wrote, I think.
That's awesome. What time of year did you do that?
Oh, that was in the summer, so
Okay.
mid to late August, I think. Yeah.
Okay. That is such a cool hike. Mount Mitchell was my first high point. I was living in North Carolina at the time, in central North Carolina.
Okay.
So on long weekends, I'd go out to Asheville because I love it out there. It's, first of all, temperature-wise, it's cooler than the rest of the state. And it's just such a fun town to hang out in. And when you want to go hike, you can just drive a couple minutes outside of town, and there's beautiful trails, beautiful parks, waterfalls. There's a national park not far away, the Great Smoky Mountains. I love that area, and it's so memorable for you as well.
Oh, totally. One of my, big takeaways from that area is the Blue Ridge Parkway. I think
Oh, yeah.
I feel like it's something I should be teaching my students. It's
Yeah.
so beautiful, and you can drive from literally Washington D.C. all the way down to Cherokee in North Carolina, and then you get to see this really cool museum about Native American culture too. And
Yeah.
you're just seeing for miles, miles and miles at a time. And now that I'm kind of more into climbing, as I'm going through, I'm like, oh, I can climb up that. I could, you know, go rock climbing up there with a buddy too. It's just so precious to me, because we don't really have that elevation in Massachusetts.
Depending on the time of the day that you drive along the Blue Ridge Parkway, it does actually look smoky, and the mountains actually look blue.
I know. I thought it was a misnomer, and then actually
Yeah.
did a separate road trip down to Asheville with my mom, and we hiked along the Blue Ridge Parkway together.
Mhm.
And she was saying, "Why is it not blue? You said it was going to be blue." And I was like, "Well, it's the wrong time of year, I think, and all that." But it definitely, especially in the late summer, it does kind of look blue at a certain point for sure.
Yeah, yeah, that's right. That's cool. So Mount Mitchell, you get up to the highest point east of the Mississippi. It's a very iconic sign in our niche little endeavor. We all know that sign. So then were you like, okay, I'm a high pointer, I have 49 more to go, or what was what where did it go after that?
Um, yeah, so a few months later, I was back in the classroom, and teaching can be pretty encompassing. So I wanted to kind of find a hobby. And then I had joked with my friends up here that I was going through a quarter life crisis at 24, and I needed to find something to do outside of,
Been there,
working
yeah.
so much. Yeah, yeah. And, I'd said that I was into hiking and all that. And my buddies were like, well, what could you do with that? And I was like, well, I don't know. I went to the tallest mountain in North Carolina. Maybe I could start doing some of the other ones across, in the area or whatever. And they started laughing, like, what is that even called? I'm like, I don't know. So I Googled it, and it turns out it was high pointing, right? And there was a
Mhm.
club for it and a cool website and all that. My friends, Adam and Max, they're a couple of guys that I grew up with. I've known them for well over half my life. And, we were interested in doing a couple of these together. So we actually drove down to Rhode Island, and that was going to be
Mhm.
number two. And I tried to recreate the picture of me at the top of Mount Mitchell, where on my Mitchell was obviously very exhausted and kind of leaning against the sign. And people actually were taking pictures of me next to the sign on the top of Mount Mitchell as if I was some sort
Really?
of artifact. Yeah, it was pretty funny. So we actually recreated that picture at the top of Rhode Island together and had a good
Mhm.
laugh about it and then wandered around. But that's where we kind of that's where I started getting the idea of pairing the mountains up with local breweries.
Yeah.
And so we actually went to, I had it written down, but it was the smallest brewery in Rhode Island. So the smallest brewery in the smallest state in the country after doing the highest point in the country. We thought it was a bit poetic.
That's fun. That's really cool. So for the podcast listeners who are not watching on YouTube, you are recording this podcast from your classroom. There's a whiteboard behind you, probably with science things because you're a science teacher. Um, so that's where you are. That's what you do. That's why you have your summers free. Just wanted to throw that in there
Yeah.
because you mentioned the classroom, and I'm like, they probably don't know. You do Rhode Island. Then did you join the High Pointers Club after that or before that?
I think I actually may have joined before that. Pretty much once I found out about it and started using the website, I felt a bit of an obligation to kind of pay my dues, monetarily.
Sure.
But I wasn't really invested in the club until probably a couple years later when I was a little more committed to high pointing itself. If
Yeah.
that makes sense.
Yeah, for real. So when did that like turning point happen where you became a little more committed and more serious to maybe going further in terms of travel to High Point?
It was definitely Katahdin.
Oh,
So
okay. Okay.
in the fall of 2017, I had done a couple of the smaller ones in New England. The Greylocks,
Hmm.
Mansfield in Vermont, and obviously Rhode Island too. But Katahdin, like I was really curious about it, and I looked up. I don't know if you've done it yourself, but I looked up. The end of the Appalachian Trail going up Able, but also on
Hmm.
the other side going up Helen down Taylor. And I saw that was called a Knife's Edge, and I was like, "Oh, that's pretty cool. I might check that out." And I'm still obviously not. I'm pretty green to all this stuff, but at least my fitness is a little better.
Hmm.
And yeah, I just remember sitting in my classroom. It's a different room than the one I'm sitting in now, but same school. Kind of looking up the weather and saying, "Hey, I got a little window here this weekend. The foliage has already changed. It should be not very crowded. Let's give it a shot." And I got up to Parky Permit and headed up there. And once again, did this by myself. And
Yeah.
I got up Helen to Pomola, and I saw the Knife's Edge, and I was like, "Holy crap, this is really cool," and also, a little scary. And once you start the Knife's Edge, you actually descend into a chimney, which had, at the time, it felt like quite a bit of exposure.
Hmm.
And I remember thinking, well, I'm either going to do this high pointing thing or not, and I'm going to give it a shot. I'm already here. And so I went down the chimney and went around the Knife's Edge. It took me about an hour and a half, and I got to the summit. Katahdin has this beautiful sign at the
Yeah.
top of it. It's
That's
mostly,
another iconic sign.
yeah, for sure, because you're meeting folks that finished the AT. And
Hmm.
once I did that and, made it back to the car safely and all that, I was like, all right, I think I can do this. And so I started kind of planning out my summers to do my road trips to do some more high pointing.
Wow.
The fourth time I did Katahdin, which is my favorite mountain. Um, I went up Abel, which is the end of the Appalachian Trail,
Hmm.
and I just needed a day to get away. Work was stressing me out a little bit, and the folio was changing, and I really just wanted to get up there for the weekend. So I kind of did this impromptu trip again to Katahdin, probably about a mile from the summit. There's these giant boulders, and do a little bit of boulder hopping and all that.
Hmm.
And as I mentioned earlier, like Abel is the end of the Appalachian Trail. And so as I'm kind of getting to these boulders, I hear someone yelling, and I'm like, "What the heck is going on?" And they were screaming V, V like the letter. And I had anticipated that they were in pain or something. So I came around the boulder and I said, "Hey, you doing okay?" And I startled the person, and they were really scared, and they were injured. And so the person said, "Hey, sorry, I busted my shoulder. I was actually in the hospital last night. Um, and I've been on this trail for a really long time, and I'm just hoping to finish it today." I'm like, "Oh, cool. How long you been on the trail for?" And she goes, "April." And I'm like, "Wait, it's almost October. Where did you start?" And she goes, "Georgia." And I'm like, "Wait, you're finishing the Appalachian Trail today? Isn't that crazy?" She tells me her
Yeah.
name's Mojo. She had separated her rotator cuff or torn it like a couple days
Okay.
earlier and actually spent the night in the hospital the night before this. But she had, literally came all this way. She wanted to try and finish it, but the boulders, you kind of needed some, hand movements, gripping power to get through it,
Yeah.
and she just wasn't in a position to do it. And she was saying that she was nervous and scared and wanted to turn around. And I said, "Well, hold on. I've done this a bunch of times. Let me show. I'd be happy to show you the way. Like we can't give up here." And she said, "Okay,
Yeah.
let's do it." And turns out she's, a teacher from Alaska, more of us out here.
Oh, cool.
Yeah, I know. We have this like, symbiotic thing going with all of us. And you know, we keep going and she's starting to pick up steam again and have a little bit more confidence. I told her to ditch the trekking poles and, helped her, at one point I was actually just pulling her over, different parts of the trail to get to the summit. And so we get through that crazy part of the climb, and I can see the summit finally. And I looked at her and I said, "Hey, Mojo, we're gonna, we're almost there. Why don't you lead the rest of the way?" And she goes, "Well, I don't know." And I'm like, "No, just follow the trail. Like this is your moment. You've been on here for months now.
Hmm.
You're gonna finish this thing." And so she actually gave me a big hug in a really like precious moment. And then in like this movie style climax, she goes, "I think I found my mojo back." And I'm like, "Oh, that's where the name comes from." Yeah, and we get to the summit a little bit later, and she's taking her summit picture with a couple of friends she met on the trail, and it was so cool just seeing her like have this cool moment. This person I met a few hours earlier, and we talked a few minutes afterwards. She was going to descend on the other side of the mountain. I was going to go back down Abel, and she said, "Hey, before you go," and we exchanged contact info. She said, "I would like to give you your name. On the Appalachian Trail, other
Yeah.
hikers give you a name and stuff." And I was like, "All right, what you got for me?" I think it's gonna be some sort of like teacher thing or whatever. And she goes, "Nice guy." And I'm like, "Oh, hell yeah, I like that actually. That works." That's
So,
funny.
so let's talk about some of your trips out west. When did you start doing that?
A couple, yeah, I want to say around 2018. Yeah, 2018, 2019, I started, expanding out west.
Hmm.
In 2019, I went to a monastery to learn how to meditate in
Okay.
Delaware, of all places. Ironically, I didn't do the high point then. I'd done it a few months earlier. But
Hmm.
after that, I flew to Vegas and grabbed a rental car and then started kind of bumping around there. I
Okay.
did, oh God, what's the high point in Nevada? It's Boundary Peak still, right? Yeah. Sorry. And I did Boundary Peak and about 12 hours or so, and it was good, but looking back was probably should have waited a little bit because 2 days later I tried Whitney, and that was just a lot of fun. Learned a lot about myself and a bit of a mess at the same time. Have you done Whitney before?
Yes. Which
Yeah,
route did you take?
I was just gonna ask. I that time I did the Mountaineers route.
Hmm.
Although the last Spoiler alert, I did not get to the top.
Same. Same. I got weathered out when I tried to do the Mountaineers route. I did it in like late March,
Okay.
and we just got caught in a storm, so turned around, and then I came back in the summer, did the Mountaineers route again, which is, the weather was perfect. There was no snow. We still got to the top.
Oh, that's cool. Yeah, I did it on July 4th, 2019, and there was a ton of snow that year. A
Wow.
lot more. Yeah, I thought it was normal to have that much snow up, at that point, but it turns out it was an anomaly. And but I decided if I was going to do Whitney, I really didn't want to do the standard route. Just the idea of doing the 99 switchbacks didn't appeal to me.
Yeah.
And so I was like, oh, this Mountaineers route, that sounds fun. I'll give that a shot. And like, prior to flying to Vegas to do Boundary, I'm in Philadelphia at an REI with my buddy, and we're trying to figure out how to buy the correct Mountaineer Zacks and stuff. So clearly I wasn't like, prepared for it.
Yeah.
And I rented some crampons at one of the climbing stores in Bishop before
Hmm.
Whitney. And the guy's like, "Oh, do you have the correct shoes?" I'm like, "Yeah, I think so." I did not. They were just these, generic hiking boots you would grab at REI and stuff. But we still
Yeah.
let me rent their crampons anyways. And
Okay.
I got onto the Mountaineers route, and I did pretty well for the first, like, 5 or 6 hours on there. And then the thing was, I didn't put the crampons on correctly. Just didn't know how
Oh
to put
no.
them on until I met some really nice climbers out there, and they showed me how to do it. And I was looking at them like, "Do you guys think I should keep going? Like, I don't even know how to put on crampons." They said, "Well, actually, we saw you coming up, and you're moving quick enough that we figured that you were just gonna solo it in the day." And I'm like, "Wow, all right. Well, I guess I got to keep trying now." And
Yeah.
I got up to the chute, which is, I think, is about 1,000 feet up, and I just once again did not know what I was doing. Went straight up the thing instead of kind of zigzagging up and creating my own
Okay.
switchbacks. And eventually, I got up over it, took a took a nap for about 45 minutes because I was really tired and
Yeah.
also getting a bit sunburned. And then I got to the point where I was just so tired I actually couldn't make the last mile and a half to the summit itself. Even though it was basically a walk up. And so
Yeah.
all in all, the my first trip on Whitney, it took about 24 hours from car to car. I started at 3 a.m. on the 4th and finished at 3 a.m. on the 5th. Uh, yeah, I mean, I never felt unsafe. I know the story might seem that was unprepared, which is partially true, but I never felt like I didn't have control over the situation. I just knew I was tired
Hmm.
and need to learn the correct mountaineering techniques to do well on those kind of peaks.
Hmm.
But I knew I was going to go back, and I did a few years later too. I know my mother's going to be listening to this and being like, "What is wrong with this child?" Because she did not know that that it took that long.
Okay, when I was on Whitney, there were people, you said that you took a nap on not the top, but at the end of the chute. There was a
Yeah,
couple
yeah.
that we ran into. They took a nap on the summit overnight. So they slept up there all night.
Yeah, that's
And
not a nap, I think.
no, no, they fell asleep up there. And we caught them like as they were coming down, but their descent was so slow. And we're like, "Hey, do you guys just want to like follow us?" And they're like, "No. We're just going to sit here. We slept on the summit last night. We're just going to take it slow." And so we were on our way up. And then we came down and they're still in the same spot. And then we're like, "Guys,
Oh
come
my
on.
God.
Like you have to come with us." They're like, "No, I'm going to FaceTime my mom." We're like, what's that going to do?"
And also, there's no cell reception there. It's only on the summit, I'm pretty sure. Like,
I
holy
know, I
crap.
know. They, I hope they're okay. It's like that meme with Kermit the Frog when he's looking out of the window with the raindrops, and he's like, "I wonder what happened to the people who asked me for directions." Like, I, I hope they're okay. You know,
That's a good one. That could be the logo of your podcast. It's staring off at the high points.
I wonder what happened to the high pointers who asked us for directions. So when you went back, did you do the Mountaineers route?
I didn't because there was no snow.
Yeah.
I knew it was just going to be scree, and I figured I just wanted to get to the top. That the time I went back to Whitney, I driven out from Lynn, Massachusetts to Portland, Oregon by myself.
Okay.
It was like the day after school ended, I just beelined it across the country. And it took me 4 or 5 days. And I went to Portland because I wanted to do Hood. I ended up not being able to attempt Hood that time because my car got smashed in and probably about $5,000 worth of my climate equipment was stolen.
No.
Yeah, it was like my
Oh.
second night in Oregon, and I was just like, "You got to be kidding me!" And I was very frustrated, but I was already, across the country. I decided at that point I wasn't going to turn back.
Sure.
And so I bought some used gear, and some of my really sweet friends Venmoed me a few bucks here and there to buy some, new trekking poles and shoes and all that.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, I decided if I was going to do Whitney again, I would just do the standard just because I didn't have any other equipment to do it with.
Yeah. That's so strange that when you were there on July 4th, there was so much snow because I summited July 3rd, 2022,
Oh, cool.
and there was no snow.
Oh, really?
That
Yeah.
nothing. And it was perfect. I mean, we were kind of like we were a little warm. And when we were there a couple months before trying out the Mountaineers route in the winter, I mean, we were in the storm, like in the clouds. There were
Whoa.
the wind was like 50 miles per hour. The wind chill was minus 31. And we were laying in our tent and like the tent was coming down and slapping me in the face. And I was just
Oh
like,
my God.
like this is what you hear about like in the Himalayas, in a storm. It's like I'm on Mount Whitney. Like we're at Lower Boy Scout Lake.
That's pretty gnarly. Did you guys end up turning around because of the weather?
We did. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah,
Um
definitely the smart move.
yeah. But I did a guide service because I didn't know my way around the permit system and I didn't know how to navigate around that mountain, so I was just like, take me up. But yeah.
The
So what
permit system is
brewery?
such a pain. Sorry.
Yeah.
You can edit
What
that out if you want, but I want it on the record.
No, I agree with you, and that's why I went around it. So, okay, you do Whitney, then you're already out on the West Coast after Boundary. Did you do anything else before heading back to Massachusetts?
Yeah, I think that summer I went to New Mexico, hung out in Albuquerque and Santa Fe for a few nights. I'd always been interested in checking out the Pueblos down there. And
I
then,
loved that. That was my
oh yeah,
favorite part of Wheeler Peak. Taos is beautiful
oh my God, I
in,
loved
in
it.
Santa
Yeah,
Fe.
I
Yeah.
absolutely, yeah. I actually done Wheeler a couple summers earlier,
Okay.
so I didn't go to Taos that summer. But Albuquerque was just super cool. My dad's a big Breaking Bad fan too, so I ended up getting him a
Oh
little
yeah.
bit of merch. Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, he was very excited.
Yeah.
And then Santa Fe was also pretty fun too. I actually stayed in one of the little adobes, which is
Oh,
pretty
fun. Yeah.
beautiful. Yeah, and like the natural cooling was, got the science teacher in me really geeked out.
Hmm.
And then after that, I drove up to the San Juans in Colorado, which is like always gonna have a special place in my heart.
Hmm.
Um, and stayed in Telluride and did some climbing out there with a couple of guides that I knew. When we went up Mount Wilson, which is like a class four, scrambled some rock climbing there too, and that was just super beautiful. As I get more into high pointing each year, I kind of realize that I want to be more vertical when I do my outdoor adventures. You know,
Hmm.
so much of hiking is, about movement and your, aerobic base and that kind of training. And now with the White Mountains about, 2.5 hours north of me here, ice climbing's kind of been my calling, I think. It's something I really
Yeah.
want to get more into too.
Hmm.
So yeah, I always take every chance I get to, if I can, to go climb with a guide and learn from them.
Yeah. That's awesome.
Yeah, so after that, I drove to Henry's Fork and did Kings Peak. I
Yeah.
did an overnight by myself for a couple nights, which is really, really cool. Because I was so bummed out a few weeks earlier, losing all my gear that I wasn't sure if I was going to hike
That
anything or
sucks.
climb anything. Yeah, it was bad luck, but it was also just stuff, like
Sure.
it
Yeah.
is what it is. I got new gear now. I'm all good. And I have some really, really special friends that were really supportive through that. And
Hmm.
I did Kings Peak, went back to the car and drove to Salt Lake City, cleaned up and everything. And then I decided I wanted to do one more and for Bora,
Oh yeah.
out in Idaho. Yeah.
Hmm.
And that one was I associate peaks out west with having like these fancy switchbacks and well maintained. Bora was just like straight up like 5,000 vertical and like 8 miles round trip, so about 4 miles. And I'm like, what is going on? This is insane. And I thought I was in decent fitness at that point, and it really kicked my butt. Ironically, while on my ascent on Bora, I had met there was a high school cross country team. I guess they do an annual trip in the area to Bora Peak. And like, this is like the teacher joke is like the last thing we want to do in the summer is like work with children. No offense. We love our students. We care about them dearly, but we also need a break and some space. And so these kids were like, joking around with me, and I'm a little grumpy. I'm being like, no, leave me. I want to have my solo time, please. And of course, we all became best buds and took a really cute picture at the summit together. It was like me and about, 12 students or so.
That's cool.
And yeah, I became buddies with the chaperones, and we ended up descending together and just talking about life. And, I was giving a little bit of advice about college and all that. But yeah, I wouldn't have met them if it wasn't going up Aurora Peak. It was pretty cool.
So along the way, do you meet other people that are high pointing, or are they just kind of doing their local hike?
Yeah, on Bora, that was the only mountain I met someone who was also high pointing, and we were actually kind of following the same trajectory. He attempted Hood. He actually got to the summit because his stuff didn't get stolen, and then he did Whitney. Then he did Whitney up up through New Mexico, and then did Elbert. And then he ended up on Bora the same day I did.
Cool.
Yeah, and we were at the same number too, so he might be close to done at this point. I don't remember his name though, unfortunately. But that was the only time I had met another high pointer on the mountain, aside from like the High Pointers convention a couple years earlier, where we all did Mount Arvin together. But I feel like that's pretty different.
So can you talk about the convention? What was that like? And will we see you at this year's convention?
So unfortunately, won't see me at the convention this year. I'm going to be in grad school.
Okay.
As soon as I find out the dates for the Georgia convention, I reached out to my advisor, and they said, yeah, you can go to the convention, but you're going to miss a semester of school. And I said, yeah, I understand. So I guess that's a part of growing up.
Valid excuse.
I know. I'm a little bummed out because the convention I did go to in 2019 in Michigan, like it was really special. It was in Lance, in the UP. I hadn't done Mount Arvin yet, and I also hadn't really met any other high pointers until that point. But I wanted to, see what it was all about. And so I flew to Chicago with a buddy, did Charles Mound with him. He's a stand-up comedian, and he was very proud of himself. It was his first ever high point. He said it was going to be his last, but we'll see if I can trick him into doing another one with me. And so his name's Joe Medoff. He asked that I plug him because he's a comedian and he needs the money. And follow him at Jokes Medoff.
We'll put his link in the show notes.
Oh my God, that'd be really funny. Not even my Instagram, just put Joe's in there. And so yeah, I drove up to the UP and stayed in I forget what the hotel is, the Baraga Inn, I think. And it was really interesting because I didn't really know what to expect. And the folks that attended the convention, they tend to gravitate to the older demographic. And I was probably the youngest person there, if not second youngest. I think I was like 24, 25 at the time. And but the thing was is that everyone could have been more friendly. Folks were coming up to me asking me, "Hey, how'd you get involved? How many high points you're at?" I think at the time I was at 38, so people were pretty interested considering how many I'd done at a relatively young age.
Yeah.
And it really felt like there was a community there. We there was a lot of time for socializing. They called it the Liars Club, where people would talk about their experiences on the mountain and stories that I guess were true or maybe weren't true, has the name. But I met a fellow named George, who is someone I think about a lot when I'm on my hikes. He was one of the first or one of the earliest 50 completers, and his last was Denali.
Okay.
He doesn't have social media, so I don't know his last name, but from what I remember, he was a mainstay in the community, the High Pointers community. So I hope he'll be there in Georgia so you can meet him. And we would just hang out at the hotel bar, and he would just tell me stories about climbing and how different it was back then. Doing Denali now, especially with the guide service, I think it's quite different than what he had been doing 40 years ago with his
Sure.
climbing team, especially because it was with guys that were like him, that were learning as they were going. Um, but it was really nice to get to know folks like him. I told him that I was considering doing Denali, maybe not next summer, but the summer afterwards, and he
Mm-hmm.
was the most encouraging person I ever met when I told him about the mountain. He says, "No, you can do it. You have something in you. Just get out there, train, find some guides you trust, and just go for it." I was like, "Shoot, man, you believe in me more than I believe in myself. This is pretty cool." And
That is
I
cool.
yeah, and so the local news came to Mount Arvin at the summit and did a story on the Highpointers convention. And
Oh, cool.
yeah, we were all wearing our Highpointers convention t-shirts. We all looked really really fresh, and we ate some watermelon at the summit too. And Mark Comstock, the vice president of the club, did a really cool interview. He's a Michigan native, I believe.
Hmm.
But this great piece comes out, and it was really cool. And so I still remember the last night of the convention, that evening before we all disbanded to go do our local whatever high points we had our eyes set on in that area. Um, the hotel bar is packed. There's like 30 people, and we're all wearing our convention T-shirts still. And then I'm sitting on the stool facing the TV, and all of a sudden, that news story comes out, and I noticed because my face is on TV, and I
Oh,
start
cool.
yelling, "That's my face! That's my face!" And we all start cheering and yelling. And there's a couple of the old timers, including George, out there. At the lake, and we told him to come inside, and we all watched it together, and it was like this cool little like epilogue to end the convention,
Yeah.
especially my first one. It was really special to do. I highly recommend any of the listeners that haven't gone to a convention yet to definitely go to one. It's a really cool experience.
Now, you are sponsored by a brewery in Nebraska. How did that happen?
There's no paperwork or anything like that. I don't have a manager,
Okay.
thankfully. Yeah, so the I'll try and be quick with the story. So in 2018, I was driving. I got a call from my local high school that I used to go to, and they said, "Hey, do you want to be the coach for the soccer team?" And I used to play for them, and I said, "Heck yeah!" And they said, "All right, season starts in 4 days." I'm like, "I'm in Colorado right now." They said, "Well, you should probably get home soon then." And so I was like, "Oh, okay then." And I drove, cross country back, and after like maybe 15 hours of driving, I really just wanted to rest and take
Hmm.
a break, and so I, found this local brewery in the middle of Nebraska, in Holdridge. Holdridge is about a town of like 5,000 people, and the
Okay.
brewery was called Lost Way. And I really just wanted to grab a beer and have some dinner and get out of there. And I really was drawn to this idea of going to the brewery in a small town because it seemed like the brewery was the epicenter of the town. It was the social gathering spot.
Okay.
And when I walked in, that theory was proven because it was a fundraiser, I believe, for like a local church, if I remember correctly.
Hmm.
And I walk in, and I clearly look like someone not from Nebraska. I sat down, and you know was waiting to be served, and I eventually met this fella named Chris who owned a local food truck, and we became buddies. And he actually invited me to stay at his home that night. We had never met before or anything like that. We just hit it off, and had one of those nights where we were best friends. And the next morning, I drove home and started coaching the season.
Hmm.
Fast forward to the next summer, and I was driving back out to go climbing again, and I really want to meet that Chris guy, and kind of thank him because I had no idea what was going on. He was going through some pretty big life events, and I wanted to see how he was doing afterwards.
Yeah.
And so I actually went back to the same brewery, and he wasn't there. It was a completely different night. It was a very quiet night. But I became really good friends with the bartender. His name is Andy, and he's turned out was a school teacher too. I think he's
Okay.
actually an elementary school librarian, and we really hit it off. Part of the reason I like pairing up the mountains with breweries is because it's really easy to meet people on the road at breweries,
Hmm.
especially if you're traveling solo, because you just talk about beer. It's a pretty
Yeah.
good jumping off point. And me and Andy really hit it off. And ironically, at the same brewery, he invited me to stay at his home too, with his and let me meet his family and all that. Um, and he told his partner, Kalina, and they brought me back. Oh, he brought me back to the house, and I met his wife and his daughter Izzy, and we all hit it off. And during that time, he actually gave me Chris's contact info, and we exchanged some messages on Instagram, and now stay in touch. Um, but me and Andy have remained like really good friends. I've actually gone back and seen him a few times, both in Holders, Nebraska, and then he moved to Omaha with his family. And yeah, through all this, I kind of became in contact with the owners of Lost Way Brewery and became buddies with them. And the running joke is that they're sponsoring my climbing across the country. They give me some stickers and some swag and a free beer or two.
Mm-hmm.
And whenever I post stuff, especially my bigger, more interesting clients like Denali, I'll always tag the brewery in it. And they have a slogan, "Find your way." Play off
Okay.
of Lost Brewery. And I love saying, finding my way on Denali, finding my way on Wheeler Peak. It's just a fun way, fun way. It's just a fun way to, experience it. But the idea of them, they're not paying me or anything like that. It's just a place that holds a really special, spot in my heart. I actually went,
Mm.
another time I went to the brewery. I actually went on my birthday with a couple of friends who were driving with me cross country. And so I
Yeah.
can now say that I've had my birthday party in Nebraska, which I don't think a lot of folks from Lynn, Massachusetts can say. So yeah, I guess they're my sponsors.
Oh, that's fun. So you mentioned that you have been to Denali. When was that? And can you talk about that expedition?
Yeah, so I went to Denali last summer. I was on the June 22nd expedition team with Mountain Trip. I highly recommend them as a guide company. My guides were just awesome, and they taught me so much, especially the lead guide, Josh Jesperson.
Hmm.
He's just a really sweet man. And it was really cool. I went from teaching, in a 1,400 student school, which is pretty good size, to
Hmm.
being alone on a glacier with 8 other people I didn't know. And it was
Yeah, it's
like,
fun.
yeah, it was just like, I don't know, it felt like camp for the first like 10 days or so. I was probably
Mhm.
on the mountain itself for about 13 days. And we spent 9 days ascending it. And then the 10th day, I want to say, was summit day. And it was great. It was really special. The weather was perfect. My team, who I'd never met before, were really just cool. We really vibed. We had a bunch of inside jokes. Um, and to the extent that we actually sent stickers of those inside jokes to each other,
That's fun.
around the country. Yeah, and we still stay in touch too. It's the kind of people that if they just showed up at my home and needed a place to stay, I would absolutely let them in with open arms.
Hmm.
Um, Unfortunately, I did not get to the summit. On summit day, um, when you are trying to, get to the top, there is a portion of the trail called the Autobahn. It's relatively narrow. It's about maybe 2 or 3 feet wide, and it's a one way, meaning that like if you're descending, you're gonna have to wait for everyone who is ascending to pass by you before you can go. There are some
Okay.
fixed lines too on the right side, and then the left side is a lot of exposure. And I was wearing over boots, under I forget what they're called, under 40 over boots or whatever,
Hmm.
which I will probably never do again. They're not great for crampons, especially for fitting the crampons. Even if you adjust them and you have the fine tuned stuff, it just doesn't feel the same. It's
Okay.
kind of like playing the guitar, but you're wearing multiple layers of gloves or mittens almost. You just don't have that dexterity, which is really important on
Sure.
the mountains, especially Denali. And unfortunately, my left crampon got loose and fell off my boot. And so I yelled up to the guide. We're traveling in groups of three, right? So I'm
Yeah.
roped up with 2 other fellas. And the lead guide, Josh, is ahead of me. And then one of my partners, George, is behind me, who's doing the 7 summits. And I think he's at 4 now, which is really cool.
That's cool.
And yeah, he's a really swell guy. So I yelled up to Josh. And I was like, "Hey, my crampon fell off." And he said, "All right, sit down. I'll come on and fix it for you," because I was wearing these, my massive summit
Hmm.
mitts. And it's 17, 18,000 feet. Clearly, my brain wasn't working properly. And as I went to sit down, I tripped over the rope behind me and actually fell off the Autobahn about 30 feet.
No way.
Yeah, it was definitely a little scary. And I was able to self-arrest on the side of the Autobahn with my Mountaineer's axe and one crampon. And
Mhm.
you know, meanwhile, I still have, one crampon just dangling around my ankle, and I'm praying that it stays there, or else I'm going to be in really big trouble. Thankfully, it pays to go with guides, and the guide and George were able to, build an anchor system for me, so I didn't fall any further. But I was
Mhm.
still 30 feet off the Autobahn. And so, Josh is a Navy SEAL. He's very acclimated to high stress situations. So he leans over the side, and I'm hanging on the side, and he goes, "Hey, nice self arrest. Now you got to climb up." And I kind of looked at him, and I said a lot of things that I cannot repeat on this podcast, but and we were both somewhat joking, but I was also a little frustrated.
Yeah.
And yeah, he actually encouraged me to climb up myself. So I actually climbed back up to the Autobahn, missing a crampon. And, at that angle, you definitely want two ice tools, not just a Mountaineer's
Yeah.
axe.
Yeah.
And I got back up, and, at that point, I was pretty exhausted physically. I think on summit day, you're always going to be really tired. But mentally, I was pretty messed up, I guess.
Mhm.
It was one of those deals where, like, if that rope broke, not sure, not sure I would have died, but I definitely would have been pretty seriously injured.
Yep.
So I continued on for like another hour and a half or so, maybe 2 hours. And at that point, I was having trouble breathing with the acclimatization. I got to
Mhm.
about 19,000 feet. And then, given full credit to the guides, they never told me to turn around. It was my decision. But
Oh,
unfortunately,
okay.
yeah, I mean, mentally, I just wasn't. Yeah, mentally, I had already fallen off the mountain and I didn't get back up, even though
Oh,
physically
yeah.
I did. So
Mhm.
it's one of those things I still think about a lot. I mean, overall, it's still a great experience.
Mhm.
Yeah, it was still a great experience and really special. And I was happy that nearly all my teammates were able to get to the summit still too.
That's cool. Do you think you'll go back?
Um, yeah, I think I kind of have to. Um,
Well, it's on your
yeah, I don't
mind.
know.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, it's not even for like the High Pointers Challenge, which even though I
Mhm.
love doing this and seeing the country this way, it's just something I have to do for myself, I think.
Mhm.
I yeah, if I'm ever going to kind of, you know, I need to believe in myself. And I think if I'm going to summit that mountain, that's the first step of that. Because I do kind of second guess why I turned around at that point, even though it was a pretty wild experience.
Yeah. Well, I think at sea level, it's easy to question your logic up there, but you knew what you were going through up there, so it sounds like it was the right decision.
Yeah, for sure. But yeah, I'm definitely gonna go back. I just don't know when. I got a lot of other stuff going on back here in Lynn,
Hmm.
between work and grad school and a few other things coming up. But yeah, I'll definitely be back someday. It's such a beautiful place. I couldn't recommend it more.
Really.
Especially to high pointers, climbers, whoever. It's funny as I listen to like a lot of your interviews, folks. I can hear folks talk about Denali and say, "Yeah, I'm going to do it someday later on in a few years." And I almost feel like, hey, don't doubt yourself yet. Like,
Yeah, yeah.
you learn some of the skills, go with some guides, and be more open to it because I genuinely think a lot of folks can do it as long as you don't have you're not plagued by self doubt. You believe in what you can do.
Well, I think the mental roadblock, I guess, for a lot of high pointers is the amount of time that it takes to get up that mountain. And like that's the amount of time you have to take off of work, the amount of money that you have to pay for all the logistics and a guide. And then what if you don't get up and it's just like, man, I've been waiting all these years to do that, Because there's always a possibility that you get turned around before the summit, not just on Denali, but any summit that you do. And there's an investment, a monetary investment, and then the training and all that you put into these mountains. And I think people want to guarantee that they're going to make it up, but that's impossible.
Yeah, no, and I take that well, and I think it's hard, especially when you have a family too, and you have
Mm,
other obligations that are more important than any mountain. I think, I just think it's important that we don't psych ourselves out of attempting something that we want to do still at some point in
I
our
agree.
lives, right?
Yeah.
I genuinely there's this metaphor with golfing that a great golfer is, made up of 15% physical skill and 85% mental skill. And I think mountain climbing to an extent abides
Hmm.
by that. I think, obviously you need to know how to do a self-arrest correctly and belay and all these other really important things. But also being able to break down the mountain into smaller chunks is important.
Yeah.
Nick, who I mentioned earlier, who Ayala, who helped train me for Denali, he's a very funny guy. He's also a really cool climber. And when I was telling him how nervous I was about climbing Denali and how long it would take, and you could be on that peak for 21 days if the
I
weather's really
know.
bad. And
Hmm.
he goes, "Hey, I know you're a vegetarian, but here's your metaphor for the day. Uh, how do you eat an elephant?" I'm like, what? And he
Oh,
goes,
one bite
"One
at a
bite at a
time.
time."
Yeah.
And Denali's kind of like that, I guess. You just take it one
Hmm.
step at a time, and you know, make sure your head is up the whole time. You're looking up, not down.
Hmm.
Taking in those views.
How was the weather?
It was perfect. It really was great. On the
Yeah, because you
ascent, we
said
got
13
super lucky.
days you were that high, and I was like, oh, it usually takes people a little longer.
Yeah, we got really lucky, and we were the last team of the season too for all the guide groups.
Okay.
We yeah, we actually proclaimed ourselves the closers, and
Nice.
thanks. And yeah, we get lucky. It was high and dry the whole time we were up there.
Wow.
Like to the point that our acclimatization days, we were still outside the tent doing activities together, like Denali yoga or playing some Olympic games or whatever. Um, the descent was, a little sketchier. We had some whiteout days, especially going from 14 camp to 11 camp. Um, but that was only
Wow.
like within 24 hours or so. It was definitely a little sketchy, and also going from high camp to 14 camp itself over the ridge was really a lot of high winds, low visibility. That would have been a lot more intimidating, I think, if we didn't have such good guides showing us the way.
It really makes such a difference, doesn't it? And then when your
Yeah.
guide is experienced and confident, that puts you at ease too. So what's your next high point?
So I just did Hood a couple weeks ago, which was
Oh
really
yeah.
fun,
Yeah, how was
and that
that?
was yeah, it was beautiful. I liked the idea of going earlier in the season. The weather was really cool, and it was a bit of a redemption story after driving out to Oregon a few years earlier and not being able to attempt it because of lack of
Yeah.
gear, and
Hmm.
also that was my first high point attempt since Denali, and there was some
Okay.
trauma that I was going through. I think after the fall that I really wanted to kind of deal with in a
Hmm.
triumphant way, at least hopefully.
Hmm.
So that was really cool. So yeah, I'm at 45 now. I've been toying with the idea of Gannett or Granite. I have a friend out in Bozeman who I'd love to see again, and she said she's a little interested in doing some climbing. So maybe try Granite this summer. Gannett, I've also would love to do. I've been kicking around the idea of soloing Gannett. I'm not sure how I feel about it yet, which probably means I shouldn't attempt it. But I was talking to some guides who had worked on Gannett and explaining like my Denali experience and all that, and they said, "Hey, don't rule yourself out. So maybe I should take my own medicine with that." Yeah, my friend Eric, he's another guide with Mountain Trip. I told him I was considering doing Gannett, and he immediately cut me off and said, "Pay for the horses. Whatever you do, ride the horse
Yeah.
in. Get the other horse to carry your gear because that approach can be really taxing."
Yeah.
Um, yeah, absolutely. It'll be definitely an aerobic challenge, I think, in terms of conditioning, right? Because
Hmm.
it's like 50 miles total.
Yeah.
It could take you up, 5 to 7 days too. So it'll be fun. But it also just I don't know. There's something special about being alone in the woods by yourself too. I
I
think
agree.
it's just a lot of
Yeah.
fun.
And people have also said that that's one of their favorite high points because it's so
Oh, really?
beautiful there. And
Hmm.
also, I think it was James's episode where he said it was either granite or gannet, but there were mountain goats up there that would follow you to when you go to the bathroom, and they would consume your urine for the salt content.
I
They like
yeah,
literally watch you pee and then
I've
just
heard that in Colorado too on Elbert.
oh okay.
It's kind of cute, and then I've heard like some pretty crazy horror stories about people going to the bathroom and then these goats just going nuts for the sodium,
Yeah.
and getting like potentially violent. So yeah, it's a serious thing actually. Beware the goat. Yeah.
Right. That's awesome. So what are some of the benefits that you think high pointing or just being in the outdoors in general has brought to your life?
Yeah, you definitely learn something about yourself that you wouldn't, you know.
Hmm.
I'm always gonna be kind of privy to doing some solo stuff too. I'm a bit of an independent person, and the idea of traveling by yourself, whether it's in the woods or on the road, is pretty cool because people are more likely to approach you and get to know you more.
Hmm.
Whereas, in your groups, people might be a little more intimidated if you're in a big group. I don't know if it's some evolutionary thing. Um, but in terms of just being, you know, in the wilderness and climbing and all that, you're always going to grow through that experience, whether you get to the top or not. And that's something that can't really be taken for granted.
So this is one of my favorite questions to ask guests. When you're traveling or just in your free time, which I doubt that you have between being a teacher and being a student, are there any documentaries or books or podcasts about outdoor adventure or high pointing that you would recommend?
Yeah. If you're interested in like climbing, um, Cold Fear is really cool.
Cold
Um,
Fear. Is that a
Cold
book?
Fear. No, it's a podcast. Sorry.
Okay.
Yeah, highly recommend it. He gets some really cool guests on and some really interesting trip reports too.
Okay.
And also has a really sweet Instagram. And like kind of shows you like the literal ropes of ice climbing. If you're
Okay.
interested in training, which I have a pretty strong, inclination towards, Uphill Athlete podcast and
I
Evoke
like that one.
cast.
Hmm.
Yeah, I Uphill Athlete, they gave us a training plan for free via Mountain Trip. And that was super helpful
Oh,
in my Denali climb. I couldn't recommend it more. The
okay.
company had a bit of a split, and one of the co-founders started his own company called Evoke, and they have a really interesting podcast called the Evoke Cast too, where they interview their coaches and they talk about their experience in the hills. Not only just climbers, but they have trail runners, skimo racers, folks of all different stripes, and they go
Okay.
really deep into like the science of training for the mountains. If
Yeah.
that's people has bigger aspirations. Documentary The Alpinist about
Oh,
Marc-Andre
I love
Leclerc.
that.
Uh,
Oh my gosh.
yeah,
What a
that's like one of
story.
my
Mm.
all-time favorites. Yeah, he's just something about
What a
climbers,
humble
and they're just
guy.
so yeah, and they're so humble and real, and that
Hmm.
was really endearing. It also
Hmm.
showed like how good these climbers are, and how humble you have to be yourself when you're out there too. For my students, actually, most of them aren't going to be climbing across the country or whatever, but they're
Hmm.
curious about adventure too. And whenever they ask me about mountain climbing movies, I recommend Summit of the Gods. It's a Netflix
Okay.
anime manga. Yeah, it's
Oh, yes, I've seen that.
I rewatched it on my flight over to Anchorage before climbing Denali, and it kind of put me in like a really cool headspace.
Hmm.
It's just a really special movie. It's a bit of a mystery. The early premise of the movie is about this mysterious climber named Habu who allegedly finds George Mallory's camera, which
That's great.
obviously has its own mystery to it.
Hmm.
Um, Highly recommend Summon of the Gods, especially for folks over 13 or 14.
Yeah.
Yeah, don't be afraid to go out and like just take a map or something and point to a couple things that seem interesting on that map. And with the careful preparation, and if you want to go with folks, go with folks. But if you want to go by yourself too, just make sure you tell someone where you're going, and just
Hmm.
kind of do it and go on your own adventures. I think it's really important, especially for young people, because they're so stressed out. The pandemic's been so hard on them. I see it in my classroom all the time
Yeah.
that they need to be able to disconnect in order to grow a little bit. And
Hmm.
I would just say, just do it. Obviously, be smart, be safe. But don't be afraid to just go for a walk in the woods by yourself if you know where you're going. I think that's really important, especially for kids nowadays. But there needs to be some sort of healing, and nature can offer that to them.